The wind carried ash across the steppes of Mongolia in the summer of 1221, a constant reminder of what happened to those who resisted. Batar pressed his palm against the yurt's felt wall, steadying himself as another wave of nausea passed. Outside, the sounds of the camp preparing for the next campaign filled the air. Horses neighing, metal clanging, orders shouted in harsh Mongolian. He had been writing for 6 hours straight, his fingers cramped around the brush, black ink staining his calluses like permanent shadows. "You're falling behind, scribe." The voice belonged to Kulan, the senior military administrator who oversaw all documentation for the Western campaigns. She stood in the entrance, backlit by the afternoon sun, her deal coat dusty from riding. "General Subutai needs the supply records before nightfall. The Khan himself reviews these documents." Batar bowed his head, not meeting her eyes. "I'm transcribing the judicial records from Nishapur, the sentencing protocols." Kulan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or warning. "Those records are complete. You witnessed the proceedings yourself. Write what you saw, nothing more, nothing less. The Khan values accuracy above all else." After she left, Batar stared at the half-finished page before him. The characters he'd written described methods of execution implemented after the city's resistance, presented in the cold, administrative language required of imperial documentation. But between each line, he saw faces. The governor who had ordered the death of Genghis Khan's son-in-law, the merchants who had chosen loyalty to their Persian ruler over submission, the soldiers who had fought knowing they couldn't win. He had been a scholar in Samarkand before the Mongol conquest reached his city 2 years ago. His father had been a respected historian, his grandfather a poet. Their family had served the Khwarezmian Empire for 3 generations, documenting the glory of Islamic civilization in Central Asia. When the Mongol army arrived, his father had refused to burn their library, even when neighbors fled with only the possessions they could carry. Batar remembered finding his father in the library's ruins, dead from smoke inhalation, still clutching a 300-year-old manuscript of astronomical observations. He had been 19 years old. The Mongols had identified him quickly. His ink-stained fingers, the way he instinctively reached for falling scrolls during the chaos, his inability to hold a sword properly. A minor officer had grabbed him by the collar and dragged him before a recruitment station. "You write?" "Yes," Batar had whispered. "Chinese, Persian, Arabic. All 3, and Turkic." The officer's eyes had lit up. "The Khan needs scribes more than he needs soldiers. You serve the empire with your brush, or you die with your city. Choose." Batar had chosen life. He hated himself for it. Now, 18 months later, he sat in a yurt on the Mongolian plateau, thousands of miles from his destroyed home, documenting the systematic conquest of the known world. His current assignment was creating standardized records of judicial proceedings, a project ordered by Genghis Khan himself, who believed that consistent documentation would make the empire's justice system more efficient. The irony wasn't lost on Batar. He was helping perfect the machinery of his own people's subjugation. He dipped his brush again and continued writing. The report described a governor from Otrar who had seized a Mongol trade caravan and executed its members, claiming they were spies. The punishment had been designed to match the crime. Molten silver, the very treasure he had stolen, poured into his eyes and ears until he died. Batar's hand trembled as he recorded the details, using the clinical terminology required. Subject expired after application of heated precious metal to sensory organs. Duration, approximately 7 minutes. Witnesses, 43 local officials, retained for administrative transition. What he didn't write, the screaming that had lasted 3 of those 7 minutes, the smell of burning flesh mixed with scorched metal. The way the governor's body had convulsed, bound to a post in the city square, while his own magistrates were forced to watch. The lesson was clear: betray Mongol commerce, and you die by the wealth you stole. But what haunted Batar most wasn't the brutality itself. He had seen violence before, had lived through the siege of Samarkand. What disturbed him was the precision. Every punishment followed a calculated logic, designed not just to kill, but to communicate. Nobles who betrayed blood oaths died without blood being shed, suffocated under felt carpets, or crushed beneath boards as horses rode over them, because spilling noble blood was considered taboo even in execution. Common thieves faced public displays that entire populations were compelled to witness. The message was always the same: resistance is futile, but submission is rewarded. The choice is yours. A horn sounded outside, the evening assembly. Batar carefully cleaned his brushes and secured his documents in the leather case all scribes carried. The Khan required all administrative personnel to attend these gatherings, where announcements were made and orders distributed. It was also where Batar had learned to make himself invisible, standing in the back rows, never speaking unless directly addressed. The assembly ground was a flattened area at the camp's center, large enough to hold 3,000 people. General Subutai stood on a raised platform, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the crowd. Beside him stood Kulan and 2 other senior administrators, plus a handful of captured officials from recently conquered territories, potential collaborators being evaluated for usefulness. "Tomorrow we march toward the Caspian Sea," Subutai announced, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "The Shah's armies are broken, his empire crumbles, but resistance remains in isolated strongholds. The Khan has ordered that each fortified city be given one opportunity to surrender. Those who open their gates will be incorporated into the empire with minimal disruption. Those who resist—" He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Will serve as examples." Batar felt his stomach tighten. He knew what examples meant. He would be required to document them, to create official records that would be copied and distributed throughout the empire. These documents served multiple purposes. They ensured consistency in imperial policy, they provided justification for actions taken, and most importantly, they spread fear more effectively than any army could. Words, Batar had learned, could conquer as surely as swords. After the assembly, he returned to his yurt to find a new assignment waiting, a sealed letter bearing General Subutai's mark. His hands shook as he broke the wax. The message was brief. "You are assigned to document the judicial proceedings at Merv. Departure, dawn. Kulan will provide details." Merv, one of the largest cities in the world, a jewel of Islamic civilization with libraries that rivaled Baghdad. Batar had heard rumors that it had refused to surrender, that its governor believed the city's massive walls and large garrison could withstand a Mongol siege. The city had been wrong. 3 weeks ago, Merv had fallen. Now Batar would document what happened to cities that chose resistance. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat with his father's last possession, a small jade seal used for authenticating documents, carved with their family name in Arabic script. His father had used it to sign his historical works, believing that accuracy and truth were sacred duties for any scholar. "What would you do, father?" Batar whispered to the darkness. "Would you refuse and die with dignity? Or would you write their truths and survive?" But he knew his father's answer. His father had chosen to die rather than abandon his principles. Batar was choosing differently, and every day that choice felt more like a betrayal. As dawn broke over the steppes, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Batar packed his supplies and joined the caravan heading west. Kulan rode at the front, leading a group of 20 scribes, translators, and administrators. They would spend the next 3 months traveling from city to city, documenting the judicial proceedings that followed conquest. creating the permanent record of an empire built on calculated terror. The horses moved in steady rhythm across the grasslands, and Batar watched the Mongolian plateau stretch endlessly before them. Somewhere out there beyond these steppes lay what remained of the world he had known. And with every document he produced, every record he authenticated with careful calligraphy, he was helping erase it. But he was alive. And as long as he lived, as long as he held his brush, some small part of him still believed he might find a way to use his position for something more than serving his conquerors. He just didn't know what that something was yet. The ruins of Merv stretched across the horizon like a broken tooth. Batar had seen conquered cities before, but nothing had prepared him for this scale of devastation. What had once been a metropolis of 200,000 souls now lay eerily silent, its famous libraries burned, its irrigation channels destroyed, its gardens trampled into mud. The administrative camp had been established 2 miles from the city, upwind from the smell. Batar had been in the camp for 3 days now, and each morning brought new assignments. Today's task was inventorying valuable manuscripts that had been salvaged from private collections, books on medicine, astronomy, engineering, and history that would be sent to Karakoram, the Mongol capital. These belong in a library, not a warehouse, Batar muttered, carefully examining a water-damaged astronomical treatise. The calculations were sophisticated, centuries of Persian scholarship condensed into elegant mathematical proofs. "They belong to the Khan now," said Timur, a Uyghur scribe who worked at the adjacent table. He was older than Batar, perhaps 40, with grey threading his beard. Unlike most scribes in the camp, Timur had joined the Mongol administration voluntarily, seeing it as an opportunity for advancement. Everything belongs to the Khan. Cities, treasures, knowledge, people. The sooner you accept that, the easier this becomes. Batar bit back a sharp response. Timur wasn't wrong about the reality, but his casual acceptance of it made Batar's skin crawl. Did they bring survivors from the city? I heard there were negotiations. Some. Timur didn't look up from his work. Skilled craftsmen mostly. Weavers, metalworkers, engineers, a few scholars who pledged loyalty. They'll be resettled in Mongolia or China, wherever the empire needs their skills. And the others? Timur finally met his eyes. You know what happened to the others, Batar. You've read the reports. Why ask questions you don't want answered? Because I need to hear it said aloud, Batar thought. Because documenting it in sterile administrative language lets me pretend it's not real, and I need to remember that it is. That afternoon, Kulan summoned him to the main administrative yurt. Inside, maps covered every surface, detailed surveys of cities, trade routes, river systems, mountain passes. The Mongols documented everything with meticulous precision, understanding that information was as valuable as gold. Batar, Kulan said without preamble, you're being assigned to a special project. General Tolui is establishing a new protocol for handling cities that surrender voluntarily versus those that resist. The Khan wants a comprehensive comparative analysis, population survival rates, economic recovery timelines, administrative costs, long-term stability. Your job is to gather data from recent conquests and create a statistical summary. Batar felt his mouth go dry. You want me to quantify the consequences of resistance. I want you to provide accurate data so the Empire can make informed policy decisions. Kulan's voice was firm but not unkind. The Khan believes that if people understand the mathematics of surrender versus resistance, fewer will choose to fight. It's actually a humanitarian calculation. The more predictable the consequences, the fewer people die unnecessarily. The logic was sound, which made it even more disturbing. Batar was being asked to create a weapon made of numbers, a tool of psychological warfare disguised as scholarship. When do I begin? He heard himself ask. You already have. The Merv data will be your primary case study. You'll have access to all military and administrative records. I expect your preliminary report in 6 weeks. After leaving Kulan's yurt, Batar walked to the edge of the camp, where the view opened onto the destroyed city. Smoke still rose from some districts, weeks after the conquest. He tried to imagine what Merv had looked like before. The bustling markets his father had described, the famous library that had housed works from across the Islamic world, the gardens fed by an ancient Khanate system that brought water from distant mountains. All gone now. And he would be the one to explain why, in careful statistical terms, it had to be destroyed. "Struggling with the assignment?" a voice asked behind him. Batar turned to find an elderly man in worn but clean robes, a leather document case under his arm. His face was deeply lined, his beard pure white, but his eyes were sharp and alert. A surviving scholar, Batar guessed, one of the few deemed valuable enough to spare. "I'm fine," Batar said automatically. "No, you're not." The old man smiled without humor. "I'm Rashid. I was the chief librarian at Merv's House of Wisdom. Now I'm an imperial resource, cataloging what remains of my life's work so it can be shipped north like grain." They stood in silence for a moment, both looking at the ruins. "How do you do it?" Batar finally asked. "How do you serve them after what they did?" Rashid's expression grew distant. "I asked myself the same question when they pulled me from the library rubble. I had hidden there, you see, thinking the books might protect me. Foolish. But a Mongol officer found me, saw what I was protecting, and decided I was worth more alive than dead." He paused. "Do you know what I realized? Every book I save, every manuscript I preserve and send to Karakoram is an act of resistance, not the kind that makes you a hero, but the kind that might actually matter. How is helping them an act of resistance? Because knowledge survives empires, boy. The Mongols are building something vast, yes, but empires always fall. When this one does, the books we save today will outlive everyone who conquered us. Our words, our ideas, our history, those are the only things that truly endure." Rashid met his eyes. "You're a scribe. You understand the power of the written word. Use it." That night, Batar began his statistical analysis. He reviewed reports from Nishapur, Herat, Balkh, and now Merv, cities that had resisted versus those that had surrendered. The numbers were stark. Cities that opened their gates typically saw 80–90% population survival, with economic activity resuming within months. Cities that resisted faced mortality rates exceeding 70%, with years or decades needed for recovery. The data supported exactly the narrative Kulan wanted. Resistance was mathematically irrational. But as Batar compiled his charts and calculations, he began adding something extra. Between the statistical tables, he included brief historical descriptions of each city, not just their military capacity or economic value, but their cultural significance. The scientific achievements of Merv's scholars, the architectural innovations of Nishapur's craftsmen, the literary traditions of Balkh's poets. He wrote these additions in a slightly smaller script, using more poetic language than standard administrative prose. They weren't necessary for the statistical analysis, but he included them anyway, citing contextual relevance for long-term imperial planning. It was a small rebellion, almost invisible, but it meant that anyone who read his report, now or 100 years from now, would see these cities as more than just data points in a conquest. They would see the humanity that had been destroyed. 3 weeks into his research, Batar was granted access to the pre-conquest negotiation records. These documents detailed the messages sent between Mongol commanders and city governors before each siege. Offers of surrender, demands for tribute, warnings of consequences. What struck him was the consistency. Every city was offered the same terms: open your gates, provide supplies and tribute, pledge loyalty to the Khan, and you will be incorporated into the empire peacefully. Refuse, and you will be made an example. Merv's governor had refused, citing religious duty and confidence in the city's defenses. His final message to the Mongol command was defiant. "We will not submit to godless barbarians. Our walls are strong, our warriors brave, our faith unshakable." 2 weeks later, those walls were breached. The governor was among the first executed. Batar found himself sympathizing with the governor's courage while simultaneously understanding the futility of his choice. The mathematics were undeniable. Resistance led to destruction. But could anyone truly blame people for fighting to defend their homes, their faith, their way of life? He remembered his father in the burning library, choosing dignity over survival. Had that been brave or foolish? Heroic or wasteful? One evening, as Batar worked late transcribing population data, Timur approached his desk. "You're adding unnecessary detail to your reports," he said quietly. "The cultural descriptions, the historical context. Kulan hasn't said anything yet, but others have noticed." "It's relevant information," Batar replied, not looking up. "It's dangerous." Timur leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you're preserving memory, but you're really just drawing attention to yourself. In this empire, the safest position is invisibility. You do your job, you follow orders precisely, and you don't make anyone question your loyalty. Is that how you sleep at night? By making yourself invisible?" Timur's face hardened. "I sleep fine because I'm alive. My family is alive, resettled in a Mongol province where they have food and safety. Before the conquest, we were starving in a dying empire. Now my children attend schools, my wife works in a textile workshop, and we have a future. The Mongols destroyed my city, yes, but they gave me a life I never had before. So yes, I follow orders, and I don't pretend my little acts of scholarly defiance will change anything." After Temur left, Batar sat alone with his documents, feeling the weight of every word he'd written. Was he actually preserving anything meaningful, or just making himself feel better about his collaboration? Did his small additions of cultural context matter, or was Temur right that they were merely dangerous self-indulgence? He thought of Rashid's words, "Knowledge survives empires," and he kept writing. The caravan reached Samarkand on a cold morning in late autumn. Batar hadn't seen his home city in nearly 2 years, and his heart clenched as the familiar skyline came into view. The great Registan was still there, though scaffolding indicated reconstruction was underway. The Bibi Khanim Mosque stood damaged but standing. The city walls showed signs of repair. Life continued, even after conquest. Kulan had brought her team of scribes here to document the city's administrative integration. Samarkand was being established as a regional capital for the Western Territories, a showcase of how conquered cities could thrive under Mongol rule. It was propaganda, but it was also partially true. Trade had resumed, the markets were active, and the population, though diminished, seemed to be adapting. "You have 3 days of personal time before our work begins," Kulan told the scribes at their briefing. "Use it wisely. When we start, I expect full dedication." Batar used those 3 days to search for his past. His family's neighborhood was largely intact. Their area had surrendered early when the Mongol scouts arrived, avoiding the worst of the violence. But his home was occupied by strangers now, a Mongol family who eyed him suspiciously when he lingered too long outside. He found his old mentor, Professor Ishak, living in reduced circumstances but alive. The elderly mathematician had survived by teaching Mongol officers basic Persian and mathematics. When Batar knocked on his door, Ishak's eyes filled with tears. "Young Batar, they said you were dead, killed in the siege." "I survived. I'm working as a scribe for the Mongol administration." Ishak's expression shifted from joy to something more complicated, understanding mixed with disappointment. "Come in. Tell me everything." They talked late into the night. Batar described his capture, his forced service, the documents he'd been made to write. Ishak listened without judgment, occasionally refilling their tea. "You blame yourself," Ishak finally said, "for surviving when your father died. He chose principles over life. I chose the opposite. Your father chose death over betraying his calling as a historian. But Batar, you are still a historian. The fact that you serve new masters doesn't change what you are." Ishak leaned forward. "Tell me, in your documents, do you lie?" "No. I record what I witness accurately." "Then you are still honoring your calling. The truth doesn't become false just because it serves a conqueror's purposes. And preserved truth, even uncomfortable truth, has more power than you realize. But I'm helping them perfect their system. My statistical analysis of conquered cities will be used to terrorize others into submission. Perhaps, or perhaps centuries from now, a scholar will read your careful records and understand exactly what this empire was, how it functioned, and why it succeeded. That knowledge could prevent future empires from following the same path." Ishak smiled sadly. "You're thinking too small, boy. You're serving the Mongols today, yes, but you're also serving history itself. And history is patient." The conversation shifted to other matters: mutual friends who had survived or perished, the city's reconstruction, the new administrative systems. But Ishak's words stayed with Batar, serving history itself. On his second day in Samarkand, Batar visited what remained of his father's library. The building was a burned shell, but the basement storage rooms were partially intact. He spent hours sorting through damaged manuscripts, separating those that might be salvaged from those too destroyed to save. In a corner, beneath collapsed shelving, he found his father's personal journal, waterlogged and smoke-stained, but readable. His hands trembled as he opened it to the final entries, written in the weeks before the Mongol siege. "The army approaches," his father had written. "Many are fleeing, but I cannot abandon our collection. These manuscripts represent 5 centuries of scholarship. If I run, who will protect them? If everyone chooses safety over duty, what becomes of civilization itself?" A few days later, "Young Batar argues with me constantly. He wants us to evacuate with the merchant caravans. He calls me stubborn, perhaps he's right, but someone must bear witness to what is being lost. Someone must remember." The final entry, dated the day the Mongols breached the walls. "If anyone finds this journal, know that I chose to stay not from stubbornness, but from love. Love for knowledge, for history, for the human endeavor to understand and record our existence. These books are more than paper and ink. They are proof that we lived, that we thought, that we mattered. I could not abandon them. I could not abandon who I am." Batar read those words 3 times, tears streaming down his face. His father hadn't been foolish or wasteful. He had made a choice based on his deepest convictions, accepting the consequences with open eyes. But Batar had made a different choice, and that was valid too. Survival wasn't cowardice. Service wasn't betrayal. He could honor his father's principles while forging his own path. That night, Batar began a secret project. Using materials he quietly requisitioned from the administrative supplies, he created a second version of his statistical report, one for official submission and one for himself. The official version contained the expected analysis, supporting the Mongol narrative of logical surrender versus irrational resistance. The personal version included everything else: transcribed excerpts from pre-conquest documents showing the courage and reasoning of those who chose to resist, demographic details about populations displaced or destroyed, economic calculations showing not just recovery timelines, but also the wealth extracted from conquered territories, cultural assessments of what had been lost, libraries, artistic traditions, scientific communities. It wasn't resistance exactly, it was witness. He hid this personal archive in a waterproof leather case, planning to keep it with him always. Perhaps nothing would ever come of it. Perhaps it would be discovered and destroyed, and he with it. But the act of creating it gave him something he'd been missing, purpose beyond mere survival. On his final free day, Bataar returned to Professor Ishak with a request. If something happens to me, if I'm discovered or killed, I need someone to know this archive exists. He showed Ishak the leather case containing his uncensored documentation. These are the truths they don't want recorded, the full picture, not just their version. Ishak examined the documents with a scholar's careful eye. This is exceptional work, Bataar. Detailed, thorough, and brave, but it's also dangerous. I know. That's why I need you to be my backup. Every few months, when I can, I'll send you copies of my latest editions. You'll hide them separately from your own materials. If both of us maintain the archive, it has a better chance of surviving. And if we're both killed, then we tried. That has to be enough. Ishak clasped Bataar's shoulder. Your father would be proud. Not because you're resisting. He understood that survival matters too. But because you found a way to serve truth while navigating an impossible situation. That's real wisdom, Bataar. The kind that keeps civilization alive even in dark times. When Bataar returned to the administrative compound, he felt different, lighter somehow, despite the additional burden he'd taken on. He was still a scribe serving conquerors, still documenting the machinery of empire, but he was also something more now, a guardian of complete truth, a chronicler of the unspoken cost. The official work began the next morning. Bataar and the other scribes were assigned to document Samarkand's integration into the Mongol administrative system. Tax collection procedures, garrison arrangements, trade protocols, legal frameworks. It was tedious work, but Bataar approached it with newfound clarity. He would do his assigned job impeccably, giving the Mongols no reason to doubt his loyalty. And in the margins of his life, in the quiet hours between official duties, he would build his secret archive, the full story, preserved for whoever might find it after this empire turned to dust. One evening, Kulan summoned him to review his completed statistical report from Merv. She read through it carefully, occasionally making notes. "This is excellent work," she finally said. "The data is clear, the analysis is sound, and the cultural context you've added actually strengthens the overall argument. It shows that these weren't just random cities, but significant centers of civilization, which makes the choice to resist seem even more irrational given the inevitable outcome." Bataar felt a complicated mix of pride and disgust. His additions, meant to honor the destroyed cities, were being used to justify their destruction. But that didn't make preserving those details wrong. Future readers might see something different in his words than Kulan did. That was the nature of history. The same facts could support different truths depending on who was reading them and when. "General Tolui wants your methodology applied to all future conquests," Kulan continued. "You'll be establishing the standard template for pre-conquest assessment and post-conquest analysis. It's a significant responsibility." "I understand." "Good. Because the Khan himself may review these documents eventually. Your work represents the Empire's official memory. Everything you write becomes historical record." After Kulan dismissed him, Bataar walked through Samarkand's evening streets, thinking about official memory versus true history. The Mongols would write their own story, casting themselves as inevitable forces of progress, framing resistance as futile irrationality. That version would dominate for as long as the empire lasted. But in his hidden archive, other voices would survive. The governors who resisted despite the odds. The scholars who died protecting their libraries. The ordinary people whose lives were destroyed by forces beyond their control. The full cost, not just the sanitized version. That night, Bataar added new material to his secret archive. Transcribed pages from his father's journal, descriptions of Samarkand before and after the conquest, copies of correspondence between city officials during the siege. Each edition felt like a small act of redemption. He was beginning to understand what his calling actually was. Not resistance or collaboration, but something more subtle. Bearing witness to the full truth, even when that truth was complicated and uncomfortable. The Mongols would have their official history, but Batar would ensure another version survived alongside it, not to glorify resistance or condemn conquest, but simply to record what actually happened in all its complexity. That was the only real power he had, the power to remember accurately, and he would wield that power as long as he lived. Winter descended on the Mongolian plateau with brutal efficiency. Batar's caravan had returned to Karakoram after 6 months of documenting Western conquests, and now he found himself working in the empire's capital, a sprawling complex of yurts, permanent buildings, and administrative centers that housed the bureaucratic heart of the Mongol world. Karakoram was unlike anywhere Batar had been. Here, Chinese engineers worked alongside Persian architects. Uyghur scribes collaborated with captured Russian clerks. Tribute from a dozen civilizations flowed through the city's warehouses: silk from China, carpets from Persia, furs from the northern forests, gold from conquered cities. The Mongols had built an empire on conquest, but they maintained it through meticulous administration. Batar's new assignment was in the Imperial Archives, a vast repository where copies of all important documents were stored. His role was to organize and cross-reference judicial records from the Western campaigns, making them accessible for future reference. It was prestigious work, placing him at the center of the Empire's information system. It also meant he had access to everything. The archives occupied a purpose-built structure, wooden walls reinforced against fire, multiple rooms organized by region and subject, a staff of 40 scribes maintaining and updating the collection. The director was an elderly Khitan named Yelu Ahai, who had served the previous Jin dynasty before the Mongols conquered his homeland. He had that same quality Batar recognized in himself, the weathered resilience of a scholar who had survived by making himself useful to conquerors. "You'll be working in the Western Territories section," Yelu Ahai explained on Batar's first day. "Your job is to identify patterns, flag inconsistencies, and ensure our records are comprehensive. The Khan believes that an empire organized by accurate information is an empire that endures." Over the following weeks, Batar immersed himself in the archives. He read diplomatic correspondence, military reports, economic assessments, and judicial proceedings from across the Mongol domains. The scope was staggering. This empire controlled more territory than any before it, and the documentation reflected that vastness. But as he read, patterns emerged that troubled him. The judicial records showed systematic application of terror tactics, yes, but they also revealed something else: flexibility. Cities that surrendered were genuinely integrated into the empire with relative leniency. Skilled individuals were protected and utilized regardless of origin. Local religions and customs were often tolerated as long as they didn't threaten Mongol authority. The empire wasn't simply destroying everything in its path. It was building something new, brutal in its methods, but organized and, in its own way, consistent. Batar found this realization deeply unsettling. It would be easier if the Mongols were purely destructive, if their empire was built on nothing but violence, but the reality was more complex. They were creating administrative systems, promoting trade, protecting certain forms of knowledge, establishing a kind of peace. The peace of submission, yes, but still a cessation of the constant warfare that had plagued Central Asia for decades. His secret archive suddenly seemed more important than ever. Future historians would need to understand this complexity, the simultaneous brutality and organization, the calculated terror and genuine administration, the human cost alongside the systemic efficiency. One evening, while working late in the archives, Batar encountered Kulan reviewing documents in the adjacent section. They had worked together for over a year now, but he still knew little about her personally. "You're here late," she observed, trying to finish the cross-referencing for the Khwarezmian campaign records. She nodded, then surprised him by sitting down. "Can I ask you something, Batar? You always complete your assignments well. Your accuracy is flawless, and your analysis is insightful. But there's something in your eyes, a distance, like you're here, but also somewhere else. Why is that?" Batar chose his words carefully. "I suppose I'm still processing everything I've witnessed. Documenting these events makes them real in a way that being present for them didn't." "You mean you're struggling with what you're recording?" "I'm struggling with my role in recording it." Kulan was quiet for a moment. "You think that makes you complicit, doesn't it?" "Perhaps, but consider this. Every empire believes its own narrative. The Khwarezmian Empire believed it was the pinnacle of Islamic civilization, divinely ordained to rule. The Jin dynasty believed China was the center of the world, with all others as barbarians. Now the Mongols believe they're destined to rule everything under the eternal sky." She paused. "But here's what matters. Accurate records outlive propaganda. Long after this empire falls, your documents will be read by people trying to understand what actually happened. That's worth something. Even if what I'm recording helps the empire function more efficiently. Especially then. Because that's the most important thing for future generations to understand. How this empire actually worked. Not just that it was brutal or efficient, but how those things coexisted." Kulan met his eyes. "You're not serving the Mongols, Batar. You're serving history. There's a difference." After she left, Batar sat alone with his thoughts. Kulan's words echoed Professor Ishak's from months ago, serving history itself. But serving history required surviving. And survival meant he couldn't afford to be discovered maintaining his secret archive. The next day, Batar took additional precautions. He began creating coded references within his official documents, small notations that appeared to be simple organizational markers, but actually indicated which records had corresponding uncensored versions in his hidden archive. Anyone reading his official documents would see nothing suspicious, but someone with his private key could identify which events had been documented more completely elsewhere. He also started including carefully worded footnotes in his reports, phrased as administrative observations, but actually hinting at larger truths. For instance, in a report on population displacement, he noted, "Urban centers demonstrate faster recovery when original populations are partially retained, suggesting cultural continuity aids administrative stability." On the surface, it was practical advice for managing conquered territories, but it also implicitly acknowledged that displacing populations caused real harm, that cultural destruction had measurable consequences. These were small rebellions, barely visible. But they mattered to Batar. They were proof that he wasn't just mechanically serving his masters. He was finding ways to preserve nuance and complexity within the very system designed to eliminate both. 3 months into his work at the archives, Batar received an unexpected visitor. A military courier arrived with a summons. General Tolui wanted to meet with him personally. General Tolui was one of Genghis Khan's sons, a commander known for both his military brilliance and his interest in administrative innovation. The summons could mean promotion or execution. With the Mongols, those outcomes were sometimes equally probable. Batar presented himself at the general's compound the following morning, trying to control his anxiety. He was ushered into a spacious yurt where Tolui sat surrounded by maps and documents. The general was younger than Batar expected, perhaps 35, with sharp eyes and a presence that commanded attention without requiring theatrics. "Scribe Batar," Tolui said, gesturing to a cushion. "Sit. I've been reviewing your statistical analyses from the Western campaigns. Impressive work." "Thank you, General. But I noticed something interesting. Your reports include cultural assessments alongside the military and economic data. Why?" Batar's mouth went dry. This was the question he'd been dreading. I believed that understanding a city's cultural significance would help predict population behavior and resistance patterns, General. It's contextual intelligence. Tolui studied him for a long moment. That's a diplomatic answer. But here's what I actually think. You included those details because you couldn't help yourself. You're a scholar pretending to be an administrator, and your scholarly instincts keep surfacing despite your best efforts to suppress them. Batar said nothing, unsure if this was accusation or observation. I'm not criticizing you, Tolui continued. In fact, I find it valuable. Most of my administrators see conquered cities as problems to be solved, tax revenues to be extracted, garrisons to be established, potential rebels to be monitored. But you see them as, what would you call it? Living organisms with histories and characteristics that matter? Something like that, General. Good, because I have a new assignment for you. Tolui unrolled a map showing territories to the east. The Khan is planning expansion into southern China. The Song dynasty is wealthy, advanced, and culturally sophisticated. If we approach them like we approach the Khwarezmians with pure military force, it will be a long, costly war. But if we understand what motivates them, what they value, what their internal divisions are, we might achieve more through strategy than slaughter. He looked at Batar directly. I want you to compile a comprehensive analysis of Song dynasty culture, values, and weaknesses. Not just military intelligence, but deep cultural understanding. Can you do that? Batar felt his world shifting. This was exactly what his father had trained him to do, comprehensive cultural analysis. But his father had done it to preserve and celebrate civilizations, not to help conquer them. Still, the alternative to accepting was suspicious refusal. I can do that, General. Excellent. You'll have access to all captured Song documents in our archives, plus interviews with refugees and defectors. I want your report in 4 months. Tolui paused, and Batar, I know you struggle with what you're doing. I'm not blind. But consider this. If your analysis helps us conquer the Song with less destruction, you'll have saved thousands of lives. Perhaps that makes your moral compromise worthwhile. After leaving Tolui's compound, Batar walked through Karakoram streets feeling numb. The general had seen through him completely, but had chosen to use his conflicted nature rather than punish it. It was brilliant manipulation, giving Batar's guilt a productive outlet, making him believe he could serve the empire while also minimizing harm. And the terrible thing was, Tolui might be right. If Batar's cultural analysis led to a more strategic, less destructive conquest of China that would genuinely reduce suffering, his knowledge could save lives, but it would also enable the conquest itself. That night, Batar added new sections to his secret archive, not just documentation of what had happened in the West, but now his thoughts on what he was being asked to help plan in the East. He wrote, I am being made an instrument of conquest, disguised as scholarship. Every accurate observation I provide will be weaponized, yet refusing would merely result in my replacement by someone less conflicted, less careful, less likely to preserve the truth of what is being lost. He paused, then added, I choose to proceed, but I will also ensure that the full cost is recorded. If I must help conquer civilizations, I will at least preserve their memory accurately, completely, and with the respect they deserve. Future generations will know not just that these empires fell, but what they were and what was lost when they disappeared. This is the only redemption available to me, and I will pursue it with everything I have. As winter deepened and Batar began his study of Song dynasty culture, he understood that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer a reluctant captive scribe documenting what others had done. He was now actively participating in planning future conquests, applying his scholarly abilities to imperial expansion. His father would be horrified. But Batar was also building something his father never could have imagined. A comprehensive, hidden archive, documenting not just the Mongol conquests, but the civilizations they destroyed, complete with cultural depth and humanistic understanding. It was a terrible bargain, collaborating in conquest to preserve the memory of the conquered. But it was the only bargain available to him, and he would honor it as best he could. Spring came to Karakoram in 1224, bringing with it diplomatic envoys from across the empire. Batar had been working on his Song dynasty analysis for 5 months now, and the project had expanded beyond anything General Tolui originally requested. What began as tactical cultural assessment had evolved into a 300-page treatise covering Song history, philosophy, art, technological innovations, social structure, and political factions. It was the most comprehensive work Batar had ever produced, and it made him feel like both a traitor and a true scholar simultaneously. He worked in a private section of the archives now, granted special access to sensitive materials. The captured Song documents were remarkable. Philosophical texts, technical manuals, poetry collections, administrative records. The Song dynasty had achieved a level of cultural refinement that rivaled anything in the Islamic world. And Batar was helping plan its conquest. But as he worked, he maintained his secret practice. For every page of tactical analysis he wrote for the Mongols, he wrote 2 pages of pure cultural documentation for his hidden archive. Maps of Song cities with notes on their historical significance, biographies of important poets and philosophers, descriptions of artistic movements and scientific achievements, transcriptions of philosophical debates on governance and ethics. If the Song dynasty fell, when it fell, his archive would preserve what the official Mongol records would ignore. One afternoon, Yelu Ahai approached Batar's workspace, carrying a sealed letter. "This arrived for you through official channels, from Samarkand." Batar's heart jumped. He had maintained sporadic correspondence with Professor Ishak, using seemingly innocuous letters about scholarly matters to send coded references to his secret archive. But official delivery meant the contents had been inspected. He opened the letter carefully. It was written in Ishak's hand, discussing mundane matters, the weather in Samarkand, reconstruction progress, the health of mutual acquaintances. But embedded within the text, using a simple substitution code they'd established, was a real message. Your preserved materials received and secured. 3 additional copies made and distributed to trusted individuals. Network established. We are many, and we remember. Batar read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. Ishak had created a network of scholars maintaining secret copies of the full historical record. The project was bigger than just Batar now. It was becoming a distributed archive, hidden across the empire, preserving the complete truth that official records would erase. They were building a shadow history. That evening, Batar was summoned to an unexpected meeting. General Tolui was hosting a gathering of senior administrators, military commanders, and captured scholars, a monthly forum where different perspectives on governance were discussed. Batar had never been invited before. His attendance now suggested his work had gained significant attention. The meeting took place in Tolui's largest yurt, arranged with cushions in a circle to emphasize equality of discussion, a Mongol tradition that always surprised captured scholars who expected more rigid hierarchy. Around 20 people attended, including Kulan, Yelu Ahai, several military officers and 3 other scholars, a Chinese engineer, a Persian mathematician, and a Russian priest. The topic tonight, Tolui announced, is the nature of empire. Specifically, what distinguishes a lasting empire from a temporary conquest? I want honest perspectives, even critical ones. No one will be punished for speaking their mind in this forum. The discussion that followed was surprisingly frank. The Chinese engineer argued that lasting empires required cultural integration, not just military control. The Persian mathematician contended that economic interconnection was more important than political unity. The Russian priest suggested that shared belief systems, religious or ideological, were the true foundation of enduring empires. Then Tolui turned to Batar. You've spent 2 years documenting conquest and studying conquered civilizations. What's your assessment? Batar took a slow breath, aware that everyone was watching him. This was a test, but he wasn't sure of what exactly. I think lasting empires make people want to be part of them, he finally said. The Khwarezmian Empire, the Jin dynasty, even the Roman Empire eventually, they fell not just because of military defeats, but because their subjects stopped believing in them. The Mongol Empire has military power, administrative efficiency, and economic benefits. But do the conquered populations believe in it, or do they simply submit because the alternative is death? Silence filled the yurt. Several officers looked offended, but Tolui leaned forward with interest. Go on. The Song dynasty that I've been studying has a concept called the mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers govern with divine approval, which can be withdrawn if they rule unjustly. It's propaganda, obviously, but it's also a social technology. It gives people a reason to support their government beyond simple fear. The Mongol Empire is built on fear and efficiency, which works in the short term. But what happens when the fear becomes normal, when people adapt to it? What will keep the empire together then? Kulan spoke up. You're suggesting we need something beyond military power and administrative competence. I'm suggesting that empires that last for centuries give their subjects a reason to participate beyond avoiding punishment. Trade opportunities, yes. Political stability, certainly. But also identity. Belonging to something that feels meaningful, rather than just inescapable. The Russian priest nodded slowly. The scribe is describing the difference between a prison and a homeland. Tolui smiled slightly. An interesting analysis. And how would you recommend the Mongol Empire acquire this quality of making people want to belong? Batar knew he was on dangerous ground, but he also sensed genuine curiosity in Tolui's question. The empire already does some of this: religious tolerance, protection of trade routes, meritocratic administration. These are appealing features. But the conquest methods overshadow everything else. When people's first encounter with Mongol rule is watching their city destroyed and their neighbors executed, it's difficult to later convince them they're part of something worth supporting. So you're saying we should conquer more gently? I'm saying that the strategic use of mercy might be as powerful as the strategic use of terror. Show one city mercy and make it prosper, and 10 others will see benefit in surrender. Destroy one city completely, and 10 others fight to the death because they have nothing to lose. An older military commander spoke up sharply. Fear works. Terror works. This empire was built on enemies understanding the cost of resistance. Yes, Batar acknowledged, but empires that depend solely on fear require constant violence to maintain that fear. Eventually, you run out of enemies to terrorize, and then what binds the empire together? The discussion continued for another hour, with Batar increasingly surprised by the genuine intellectual engagement. These Mongol leaders weren't mindless destroyers. They were building an empire and genuinely grappling with how to make it endure. The violence wasn't random sadism, it was strategic policy. That made it both more understandable and more disturbing. After the meeting, Tolui pulled Batar aside. Your Song dynasty analysis. I want you to add a section on how to conquer them with minimal destruction. Not because I'm suddenly merciful, but because you're right. Destroying everything we conquer is wasteful. Some civilizations are more valuable intact. I'll add that section, General. And Batar, I know you maintain some kind of personal archive. I don't know the details and I don't need to, but I suspect you're recording things that won't appear in official documents. Antolui held up a hand as Batar started to protest. "I'm not going to investigate or punish you. Do you know why? Because in 200 years, when someone wants to understand what this empire really was, your honest records will be more valuable than our propaganda. I may be a conqueror, but I'm not stupid enough to think our version of events is the only one worth preserving." He paused, then added, "Just be careful. Not everyone is as pragmatic as I am." Over the following months, Batar completed his Song dynasty analysis. The official version contained detailed recommendations for strategic conquest, which factions could be turned against each other, which cities would likely surrender if offered favorable terms, which cultural institutions should be preserved to ease transition. His secret archive version contained everything else: the philosophical sophistication of Song thought, the technological innovations they had achieved, the artistic movements that had flourished, the social reforms they had implemented. He documented their achievements not as tactical intelligence, but as human civilization at its finest. He was simultaneously helping plan their conquest and trying to preserve their memory. The contradiction was unbearable. Yet he continued. In late autumn, Batar received devastating news. Professor Ishak had died. The official cause was natural. He was elderly, his health had been declining, but a carefully worded letter from a mutual friend suggested otherwise. Ishak's archive had been discovered by local Mongol authorities during a routine inspection. Before he could be arrested, he had taken poison, dying peacefully in his sleep. The secret archive in Samarkand was gone, seized by authorities. But the letter included one crucial detail. The old teacher smiled in his final hours, saying the seeds had already been planted across the garden. 3 blooms remained safe, tended by careful hands. Ishak had successfully distributed copies before being discovered. The network survived. Batar mourned for 3 days, performing private rituals his father had taught him. He had lost his last connection to his old life, the last person who had known him before he became a scribe of empires. But Ishak's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The distributed archive lived on. That winter, Genghis Khan died during a campaign in western Shia. The news reached Karakoram in early 1228, sending shockwaves through the empire. Batar's immediate thought was, what happens to all our work now? Would the empire fracture, making their documentation obsolete? Or would it continue, proving that what they'd built transcended any single ruler? The succession was contested, but ultimately maintained the empire's unity. Genghis Khan's sons divided territories but remained coordinated under the overall authority of the great Khan. The administrative systems continued functioning, the military campaigns proceeded, and the archives kept growing. The empire would endure, and so would Batar's role in documenting it. 5 years after his capture, Batar had become one of the empire's senior archivists, overseeing a staff of 20 scribes, managing documentation for entire regions. He was respected, well compensated, and deeply complicit in the machinery of conquest. He was also maintaining the most comprehensive secret archive of the Mongol Empire's human cost, cultural destruction, and civilizational transformation that would ever exist. One evening, Batar sat in his quarters writing a letter to be included in his archive, a letter addressed to whoever might eventually discover these documents. To the future reader, I am Batar ibn Ahmad, born in Samarkand in 1202, captured by the Mongol Empire in 1220, and made a servant of conquest through my skills as a scribe. I write this knowing that you live in a world I cannot imagine, reading about events that for you are distant history, but for me are present reality. I collaborated. I documented atrocities. I helped perfect the systems of an empire built on calculated terror. These things are true, and I do not ask for forgiveness. But I also preserved. Every city they destroyed, I recorded not just how it fell, but what it was. Every culture they conquered, I documented, not just their strategic weaknesses, but their achievements, their philosophies, their humanity. The official Mongol records will show an inevitable march of destiny, the triumph of superior organization and will. These hidden records show something else, the immense cost of that triumph measured in destroyed libraries, displaced populations, erased cultures, and silenced voices. Both versions are true. History is complex enough to contain both the efficiency of conquest and the tragedy of what was lost. I made a terrible bargain. I served the empire to preserve the memory of what the empire destroyed. I collaborated to bear witness. I survived by making myself useful, and I used that survival to document everything. Whether this was cowardice or wisdom, I cannot say, but it was the choice I made, and I honored it as well as I could. If you are reading this, then my work succeeded. These words outlived the empire, outlived the terror, outlived me. They survived because I survived, and because I used my survival for something more than just continued breathing. Remember us. Remember all of us. The conquerors and the conquered, the administrators and the casualties, the entire complicated truth of what happened. That is all I ask, and all I could give. Batar sealed this letter and added it to his archive, hidden in multiple locations through his network of trusted scholars. Then he returned to his official work, writing the day's reports in careful calligraphy. He was a scribe of empires, a traitor to his people, a collaborator with conquerors. He was also a guardian of truth, a preserver of memory, a chronicler of the full human cost of conquest. He was all these things at once, and he would continue being them until his ink ran dry or his life ended, whichever came first. Outside, the Mongolian wind swept across the steppes, carrying the same ash it had carried for years. But in his quarters, Batar wrote on, preserving in permanent ink the impermanent lives of everyone his empire had destroyed. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't justice. But it was witness, and witness, Batar had learned, was the only power left to those who survived when everything else was taken away.